So the top 12 companies which were selected from COP28 were to come to Davos, and AwanTunai won Founders Games, which was a fantastic moment for me. And it really felt like all the hard work Dino, Rama, and the whole AwanTunai team has put in. This is really something. We're really doing something to change lives. We're really bringing about impact, which is financial inclusion in Indonesia. And this is a textbook example for fintech lenders globally. One thing for CFOs to recognize is you can't do everything at all times and be there throughout, right? So you have to hire the right talent. I was the first CFO of AwanTunai. One of the things I did was I hired a very competent financial controller that I could trust, building these relationships with the right investors so that they become advocates of your companies to other investors. That is very important along the process.
Hi, folks. Welcome back to On Call with Insignia, where we go on call with leaders innovating the future of Southeast Asia's digital economy, or as we like to call it, ASEAN Innovation. I'm your host, Paolo Quino, and welcome back to our continuing conversation with Shilpa Gautam, the CFO of AwanTunai. So, yeah, just earlier in the last episode, be sure to check that out, guys. We do talk about the recent progress AwanTunai has made with its Series B and what that means for its business and how it's approaching, risk management and scale, and really hearing about it from the CFO's perspective, from Shilpa's perspective. So for this part too, I wanted to delve a little bit deeper into Shilpa's own professional journey as a CFO and her own sort of mindset and approach to various aspects of building a company's finance function. So I wanted to start first with Davos, which is what you had mentioned in our last episode, that really as a sign of AwanTunai's global recognition in terms of the work that it's doing. Maybe you can share a little bit more about that whole experience, how you represented the company, and what has been your takeaway from all that.
Sure. I will answer the first part, which is as a CFO, you typically don't see representation in these competitions, right? I was actually just surrounded by CEOs and entrepreneurs, right? I owe it to Dino for sending me to Davos, sending me to COP28. So how I got to Davos was there is a competition called Founders Games, which is organized by Webit Foundation, which is a group of seasoned investors who who invite impactful startups globally to come and compete. So this year, or rather 2023, there were 6,000 startups which were invited to Founders Games from across 150 countries. And through various rounds, we were then invited to Davos, which is where the finals were being held. So the top 12 companies which were selected from COP28 were to come to Davos, and AwanTunai won Founders Games, which was a fantastic moment for me. And it really felt like all the hard work Dino, Rama, and the whole AwanTunai team has put in. This is really something. We're really doing something to change lives. We're really bringing about impact, which is financial inclusion in Indonesia. And this is a textbook example for fintech lenders globally. Davos was fantastic. So when I was speaking, the audience was CEOs and prime ministers and ministers. And one of the prime ministers of a country, he came up to me and said, I really like the passion with which you speak about AwanTunai, and congratulations on building such a beautiful startup. So yeah, credit to Dino and Rama for this. And it was really my honor being at Davos.
Yeah, it must have been quite a ride. It wasn't just like a one-time thing. It was a whole process that you mentioned, several different types of formats that you had to go through and eventually make it to Davos for the finals and win. So congrats again on that. I think it's just one of many ways, I think, where you've been pushed as CFO. Even compared to joining Owen, you had already several years of experience as a finance professional. But I think it's quite interesting how you've constantly been trying to push yourself as well. I think you mentioned off the record that you had not been really that experienced in terms of pitching on stage, and this was one of those really big experiences. What was it like and pitching in front of such an audience, and what's a learning for you professionally in terms of pitching?
In terms of pitching, obviously, it's quite nerve wracking, right? Because personally, you're not just in some random room, you're in Davos, you're at the World Economic Forum. We've got leaders globally who are watching you, and it is quite nerve wracking. But I think staying true to your mission and the conviction that you have in oneself that you're bringing some positive impact, not only to the company, but to Indonesia, that is something which I was very proud of. I also had the pleasure of meeting so many other startup founders. And these were not like Series A, Series B. These were like scale ups and unicorns. And I think one thing that they all had was humility, right? And the fact that we've built something fantastic, but then there's still lots more work to be done. So I think one of the learnings was from this experience was surround yourselves with people who inspire you and continue doing what you're doing with 100% passion, integrity, and conviction.
I wanted to ask also, apart from this whole Davos experience, what are other ways in which, being working at a one twenty has really developed you as a finance professional?
I've had the perfect opportunity here to put all my past experience into practical use in AwanTunai. And so I think in terms of the impact I have given to AwanTunai as well as the other way around, I think the first impact is I gave the CEO, a trusted partner that allowed him to make the decisions and run the business with a finance lens, that there is a financial impact for every decision. And every CEO needs a good CFO to help translate that for me. I think that was one of the key things where I saw impact to the company, but at the same time, there was a lot of learning for me, right? Every recommendation I made to, meant something financially and strategically in terms of the growth of the company. And I think I put in order a robust finance function, right? So I reviewed and I restructured the finance function and started to work each of the issues that existed in the finance team, starting from the most critical down to the not so critical. So this is something I've not done in my past roles in
Right.
professional services or as a banker. So this was a lot of learning curve for me personally as well. Also, given that we're a peer-to-peer lender, there comes a lot of regulations when it comes to lending. Being compliant with those regulations was something which I have learned since joining Avantunai, making sure that business risks are addressed and controls were put in place for maybe keeping expenses down, tracking monthly performance to highlight issues before they actually even happen. So that comes from my audit background in
Right.
terms of the control process. And also, where I've learned the most was running the fundraise process and giving that time, because before I joined, Dino was running that process, right? So
Yeah.
I've given him that time to focus on the business, whereas I take the reins of fundraising. And I think also, as an external finance professional, investors have someone to trust within the business, right? So investors care about transparency, truthfulness, consistent reporting, which is what I have hopefully given to the investors since I've joined a 1 to 9.
You mentioned a couple of things there which I wanted to get into. One is, I think, the importance of really building out the finance function, finding the right talent, which you've also mentioned in the previous episode. What has been the biggest learning in terms of building that team and growing that finance function for Awan Tunai?
I went back to basics for this
Mm,
fit, right? When I joined in, I interviewed members of the finance team, assessed their competencies and aspirations. Because in every team, there's the thinkers and the doers, right?
right.
And you need a good mix of both of them. I basically created a capabilities map at the risk of sounding like a geek. I created a capabilities map for the teams, what systems do we have in place, what processes do we have in place. I coached the finance team on FP&A, partnering with other units such as product, sales, and keeping in mind that every part of the organization has a financial impact. So
Right.
it's not just for me as a CFO to realize that, but also my team, to the junior most team member who should understand that. So the financial impact of each decision. Then I've trained the team on soft skills needed to perform their day-to-day tasks, but also in terms of how to deal with diligence process of investors. Because daily processes, some can be as short as 1 month, some can be as long as 2 to 3 months. So managing that in addition to your BAU, right? Because all this process takes time away from your BAU
Mhm.
work. And given that I needed to fundraise and I was the first CFO of Avantura, one of the things I did was I hired a very competent financial controller that I could trust. And
Right.
she was a great support to me so that I could run the fundraising process and build financial reporting to the best of standards. Also, when I joined, financials were Excel based. So there was obviously lack of controls, right? So I implemented the rollout of NetSuite to automate certain processes, created simple controls such as even maker checker controls, right?
Mm.
And work towards creating an efficient and transparent financial reporting structure.
I think a recurring theme has been recognizing the financial impact of every aspect of the business, having those controls in place. You did talk about the kind of technology infrastructure you plugged in to enforce those controls. But in terms of from an organizational perspective, then, people perspective, how do you enforce those controls and try to maintain that discipline within the organization?
So when controls are lapsing, you have a warning system, right? So if, for instance, treasury controls, there needs to be an authorization matrix. So it's very hard to break that authorization matrix because at least that's external. With banks, if someone wants to make a payment above a certain threshold, they're not able to, right? So those controls, it's you have to follow to the T. But other internal controls in terms of completion, accounting entries, the timing of creation of those accounting entries, this is something I have to sit down, roll up my sleeves, look at it on a granular basis, and create these controls.
Right.
And one thing for CFOs to recognize is you can't do everything at all times and be
Mm.
there throughout, right? So you have to hire the right talent. So earlier this year, we've hired a head of internal audit whose job is to create these controls across the right divisions, be it sales, be it treasury, be it product. And with AwanTunai, we've always been lucky. The right talent wants to join us. So we have very senior leaders from OCBC, from HSBC, who've joined us, and they have been very instrumental in setting up this control framework.
And yeah, I think it has certainly paid off in terms of what you've been trying to build, as well as what you've been trying to sell to investors to build that supply of capital, as you mentioned. And maybe for our listeners out there, and I think your journey so far in One has really been shaped by bringing it from Series A to Series B. Like any big advice or takeaway from the whole fundraising process? I know you've talked about it at length, but if there's anything that you've taken away that you want to bring into future fundraisers for One, what is that one thing?
Sure. Maybe there's more than one thing, a couple of things I'll touch upon. So, look, fundraising is a very time and energy consuming process. So, I think ensuring that you engage with the right investors is of paramount importance. Back in the day of cheap equity, where investors were just valuing the companies based on TPVs and disbursements and forcing investors to jack up TPVs. We were very contrarian in that approach, right? So I think some of the takeaways would be choosing the right investors. These are investors who are aligned with management vision and will not force the founding team to change their strategy to match what their internal return targets are, right? I think many investors I came across just wanted us to have this J growth of disbursements without solving for risk. So we've learned to have the courage to walk away from these investors. I think the second aspect is demonstrating growth and your business model and being able to articulate what problems are you solving for and showing them the path to profitability. It's the importance of understanding and demonstrating the growth metrics, the sales metrics, the efficiency metrics to the investors. And the investors want to see that your business is not only growing, but it has a clear path to sustainable growth and profitability. And I think one more thing would be to not be stuck up on valuation. A lot of startups in the past have raised at some crazy valuations only to do down rounds later. And I think you need to put the business before your ego and at the same time not give in on valuation, but don't make that a sticking point. And just one last thing, which I personally found very useful, was building relationships along the way. So one interesting example is I was pitching to this fund and they said, look, we really like this business, but we can't invest. However, I know another investor I could introduce you to. Maybe things may work out. And
Mm.
that investor actually went on to be one of the investors in the Series B round. So building these relationships with the right investors so that they become advocates of your companies to other investors, that is very important along the process.
And speaking of relationships, I wanted to move into our in the orange corner. And I think since you as a CFO, as you mentioned in our first part one, was introduced to Owandonai through Insignia. I was curious to know as well what that relationship has been like working with Insignia also as an investor, how that has impacted your own role as CFO as well.
Insignia has been with AwanTunai right from seed stage, right? So Yinglan has been a massive supporter of AwanTunai, and thank you very much for that. I think Insignia has stuck with us through thick and thin. During the pandemic, a lot of lending businesses saw a lot of losses, but we were actually able to overcome these losses quite quickly, and we were able to pivot our lending strategy, from merchant lending to supplier lending. And Insignia has always been supportive. I think one thing I can personally say is Insignia is always looking out for us in terms of introducing us to strategic partners, be it lenders, be it investors, and every time England has gone to an event to talk about Insignia, I've had some reverse inquiries saying, hey, we met in England at this event and we'd like to understand more about AwanTunai, either as an investor, as a lender, or even somewhere like an FX provider or talent. So Insignia has been super helpful to AwanTunai, not just since the beginning, but even with me as a CFO, as I was preparing for the fundraise. So I think I did sit down with the Insignia team to build out, okay, this is my fundraising strategy. This is what our go-to-market strategy would be. And obviously, Insignia has been nothing but super kind and super helpful to us.
Yeah, and I hope this podcast actually also reaches the right people. If you are interested in having a deeper conversation with Shilpa about our one tonight, don't be afraid to reach out to her on LinkedIn as well. So we'll link her profile there for you guys to connect. And we've talked a lot about at the top of this conversation about the impact that you're making for Indonesian SMEs and the kind of change that you're bringing into the economy. For you as a CFO, what has been the most fulfilling aspect across the different roles that you've mentioned in part one? A lot of things to juggle. What has been the most fulfilling aspect of working on AwanTunai's mission?
AwanTunai's mission is we bring financing without collateral to the SMEs in Indonesia. And interestingly, that has not been achieved anywhere in the world at scale. So we are helping the banking industry access underbanked markets, and we are acting as the asset origination arm of such banks in Indonesia. I think the fact that we're able to effectively lend without any collateral, this is a step in the direction which opens up access to SME banking for a lot of other fintech lenders, because we've seen other fintech lenders trying to copy our product, and imitation is the best form of flattery. So our mission is to bring prosperity, improve the lives of the SME population in Indonesia. And of course, we can't do it alone. So we have built an army of partners, which is the Indonesian banks with private credit firms to bring about financial inclusion. And I get to be part of this change and bring about this positive impact.
If they're looking to jump into startups just as you did, really drawn by the mission and the impact and maybe even the technology as well, and how just like a one Tunai company may be really pioneering something in an industry or a space. What advice do you have for them?
Look, it's a sea change from the corporate world, right? And the banking world. So startups obviously operate very differently from established companies, right? So the culture of the startup and the challenge and the pace at which the startup operates is obviously very different to a company. I didn't have my army of analysts and associates in AwanTunai that I used to have in banking. So I think one is, don't be afraid to roll up your sleeves and do the job yourself. You have to wear many hats, I think, which I've touched upon earlier in the episode. When you're moving to a startup, learn about the industry and don't just go in blind. And if you have made a wrong decision, get yourself out of that soon and join a startup which really, appeals to you and can put your past experience into the right practical use, which is what I have done. And I think as finance professionals and startups, at your stage in the career, right, it's not just about the company, but it's also about the founders, the
Mm.
solid investors, the mission that the startup is looking to bring. So I think all that needs to be taken into consideration.
And circling back to your first answer, really playing to your strengths, leveraging that background that you have to bring something new into the company you're joining. And on that note, I wanted to go into a rapid fire round corner, some quick questions, short, easy answers should be fine. First, what superpower of any one of your fellow C-level colleagues would you want to have?
I would say undoubtedly Dino's ability to stay calm through crisis. He is as calm as a cucumber.
Right. If you do want to hear Dino's take on how Owen Tunai went through the pandemic and all of that, it's a very interesting, one of my favorite episodes. Do check that out. If you would be invited to produce a Netflix series or Netflix show, what would be the title of the show?
If it's about me, I would say I'm only just getting started.
Only just getting started. Awesome. Looking back now, what is a skill? Could be a soft skill or hard skill you believe you should have learned back in your time as a student.
A lot of what we do in every aspect of life is about sales and pitching. You're always, be it in a job interview or your day to day life, you are basically selling. And I think sales and negotiations, that is one skill which needs to be taught. And empathy, which is being able to see the business or the problem from someone else's point of view. a mix of that in terms of soft skills should be taught in schools.
That's a great answer and something that we've touched on throughout this conversation. If there's something you could automate in your job just by wishing for it, what aspect of your role would that be?
Generation of information the way certain investors want it is a challenge, right? So if I could
Right.
just automate generation and a date of data in a format that the investor wants just by thinking of it, that would be such an amazing superpower.
Right. Right. I guess, yeah, if Elon Musk is tuning in, I think that's a good use case for his machine. If you could pick anyone dead or alive to be your 24/7 executive coach, who would it be? And what is one thing that you would want to learn from them?
Since you've made it dead or alive, I would say Dhirubhai Ambani, the founder of Reliance Group, right? So
Mhm.
he took risks based on probability of success, right? He's taught us when you win big and when you lose small. So you need to assess your probability of success. So I think his straightforward approach to life and conquering it all, that's a lesson to learn for everyone. And he was my mentor. Wow, I'd be somewhere else in life.
On that note, thank you so much, Shilpa, for coming on the show. I think these past two episodes have been really a great refresher of it's a business that we've talked about many times on the show. But I think hearing about it from your perspective and the journey that you've had, albeit this past 2 years, but seems more, at least to me, has been quite a conversation. If you guys are interested in reaching out, joining a AwanTunai event, do make sure to connect with her on LinkedIn. And yeah, we'll leave it at that. Hopefully, we get to have you or or somebody new from the management to come over to our show once there's more news and more to talk about with
Absolutely.
AwanTunai.
Thank you so much for having me on the show, Paolo. Thank you
Right.
very much.
Thank you as well.